When a broken woman meets an Apache warrior who carries his own hidden scars, their forbidden love will be tested by blood betrayal and the ghosts of a violent past. But in the wilderness where two worlds collide, sometimes the greatest healing comes from the deepest wounds. Welcome to a story of survival, redemption, and love that defies every boundary. Stay with me until the very end and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale of two scarred souls has traveled across the world. The river ran red that October morning, not from autumn leaves but from blood. Kaelen Blackhorse knelt by the water's edge, his weathered hands cupping the crimson-stained current as it flowed between his fingers like liquid fire. 20 years of tracking wounded animals through these New Mexico mountains had taught him to read the language of blood, how long it had been spilled, how deep the wound, whether death walked close behind. But this blood told a story that made his Apache warrior's heart clench with familiar rage. This was a woman's blood, and there was far too much of it. He rose slowly, his dark eyes scanning the cottonwood grove where morning mist clung to the earth like spirits of the dead. Somewhere upstream, violence had painted the landscape with brutality. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "The river speaks to those who know how to listen, grandson. Today it weeps." Kaelen had been living alone in these mountains for 3 years, ever since the night that changed everything, the night he'd learned that mercy could be mistaken for weakness and trust could cost everything you loved. His cabin sat hidden in a valley where few white men dared to venture, where the old ways still held power, and his Apache blood sang with the rhythm of wind through pine. He'd chosen solitude over society, healing herbs over human company, and the honest danger of wild animals over the calculated cruelty of civilized men. But the river's cry of anguish pulled him forward like an invisible rope around his chest. He moved upstream with the fluid grace of a man born to hunt his moccasined feet, silent on the damp earth. His rifle rested easy in his hands, though he suspected bullets would be useless against whatever horror awaited him. The blood trail grew thicker with each step, painting rocks and river grass in violent crimson. Torn fabric caught on thorns, pale blue cotton that spoke of eastern cities and Sunday church services as foreign to this wilderness as snow in summer. Then he saw her. She lay crumpled against a fallen log like a broken doll, cast aside by an angry child, her body so still that for a moment Kaelen thought he'd found only another corpse to bury. Her dress, once the color of morning sky, hung in shredded ruins around a frame too thin for the curves that remained. Blood matted her auburn hair and painted abstract patterns across skin pale as winter moonlight. But it was the scars that stopped his breath. Even unconscious and near death, she bore the evidence of systematic torture written across her body like a map of human cruelty. Old wounds crisscrossed newer ones in a tapestry of deliberate pain. Cigarette burns dotted her arms like obscene freckles. Long, straight cuts along her ribs spoke of knife work done slowly, carefully, by someone who understood exactly how much agony the human body could endure without surrendering to death. Kaelen had seen Apache warriors tortured by cavalry soldiers, had witnessed the aftermath of raids where violence wore the mask of justice. But this was different. This was personal, intimate, the kind of sustained brutality that only happened when love twisted into its darkest opposite, when protection became persecution, when home became hell. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and the prayer felt inadequate against such evidence of evil. He knelt beside her, his large hands hovering over her battered form as he searched for signs of life. Her pulse fluttered weak and erratic beneath fingers stained with the blood of countless healing ceremonies. Her breathing came shallow and labored each exhale, a small miracle that she drew another breath. But she was alive, barely, desperately, defiantly alive. "Easy now," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "You're safe. Whatever happened wherever you came from, It's over now. As he gathered her broken body into his arms, she stirred. For a moment, eyes the color of storm clouds opened and fixed on his face with startling intensity. In those depths, he saw not the empty stare of a shattered mind, but something fierce and unbroken, something that had refused to die despite every attempt to kill it. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible through lips cracked and swollen. "Please don't." "I won't hurt you," Kaelen said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." Her eyes searched his face with desperate urgency, looking for the lie that experience had taught her always came with promises of safety. Instead, she found something that made her remaining strength crumble, genuine concern from a stranger who owed her nothing and asked for nothing in return. Consciousness slipped away from her again, like water through cupped hands, but not before Kaelen saw a single tear track through the blood and dirt on her cheek. It spoke of relief so profound it hurt to witness. The journey back to his cabin tested every skill his grandfather had taught him about moving through the wilderness without leaving traces. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, as if violence had burned away everything non-essential, leaving only the stubborn core that had kept her breathing when surrender would have been easier. Twice she stirred enough to whimper, the sound cutting through him like an arrow to the heart. Each time he murmured reassurances in Apache, letting the rhythm of his native tongue wrap around her like a protective blanket. His cabin emerged from the pine forest like something from an old story, solid log walls chinked with clay, a stone chimney that spoke of countless winter fires, windows that had been carefully positioned to watch all approaches while remaining hidden from casual discovery. He'd built it with his own hands after the world taught him that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Inside, the space reflected a man caught between two worlds. Traditional Apache medicine bundles hung beside modern medical supplies acquired from sympathetic traders. Hunting weapons shared wall space with leather-bound books. A photograph of his family taken before everything went wrong sat next to eagle feathers blessed by his grandfather's dying breath. Kaelen laid her on his bed with infinite care, then stood back to assess the scope of her injuries by lamplight. The full extent of her wounds revealed itself slowly, each new discovery stoking the fire of rage that burned in his chest. Someone had taken deliberate, methodical pleasure in breaking this woman. Someone had invested time and creativity in designing her suffering. "Who did this to you?" he asked. The unconscious form, though he knew she couldn't answer. "And why did they let you live long enough to escape?" He began the work that had become his calling since leaving his previous life behind. Water heated over the fire while he gathered supplies, clean cloth, antiseptic needle, and thread for the wounds that gaped too wide to heal on their own. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind raced with questions that had no immediate answers. She wasn't Apache, obviously. Her features spoke of European ancestry, mixed with something else, Irish perhaps, or Scottish. Her hands, despite their current condition, showed evidence of refinement. These weren't the calluses of a working woman, but the soft palms of someone accustomed to easier labor. Yet she'd somehow found herself in the New Mexico wilderness, beaten nearly to death, and left to die beside a river that most Eastern women wouldn't even know existed. As he cleaned away layers of blood and dirt, her true beauty emerged, like sunrise after the longest night. High cheekbones, a mouth that might have been quick to laugh before it learned to bite back screams. Auburn hair that caught firelight like burnished copper when it wasn't matted with violence. She was probably in her mid-20s, though suffering had aged her in ways that went deeper than skin. The worst wounds were the ones that told stories. The rope burns around her wrists spoke of prolonged captivity. The defensive cuts on her palms showed she'd fought back, at least initially. But it was the careful precision of the knife work along her ribs that made Kaelen's jaw clench with barely controlled fury. Someone had taken their time with her. Someone had enjoyed her pain. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly as he stitched a particularly deep gash but I know what you've been through. And I know you're stronger than whoever tried to break you realizes. You wouldn't have made it to that river if you weren't." Hours passed in careful work. Outside, the sun climbed toward noon, while inside the cabin Kaelen fought death for the soul of a stranger. He'd done this before, pulled wounded creatures back from the edge of forever, but never with stakes that felt so personal. Every time her breathing faltered, his own chest tightened. Every small sound of pain that escaped her unconscious lips made him want to track down whoever had done this and introduce them to Apache justice. But that was the old Kaelen talking, the man who'd believed that violence could answer violence, that blood could wash away blood. 3 years of solitude had taught him that revenge was a poison that killed the one who drank it as surely as its intended victim. When the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, she stirred again. This time, consciousness climbed slowly toward the surface instead of crashing over her like a wave. Her eyes opened with careful deliberation, taking in her surroundings with the wariness of prey that had learned hunters wore many faces. "Where?" she began, then stopped as her throat reminded her of its recent trauma. "My cabin," Kaelen said, simply setting down the cloth he'd been using to tend her wounds. "In the mountains about 20 miles from Santa Fe. You're safe here." She tried to sit up, then gasped as her body reminded her why that was a bad idea. Kaelen moved to help her, but stopped when she flinched away from his approach. Fear radiated from her like heat from a forge, and he recognized the careful stillness of someone who'd learned that any movement might trigger violence. "I won't touch you without permission," he said, settling back into his chair, "but you've lost a lot of blood. Moving too quickly right now would be unwise." Her storm-gray eyes studied his face with unsettling intensity, cataloging every detail as if her life might depend on reading his intentions correctly. "Who are you?" she asked finally. "Kaelen Blackhorse, and you are—" She hesitated, and he saw the moment when she decided truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Sarah," she said, though something in her voice suggested the name didn't fit as comfortably as it once had. "Sarah Morrison." Kaelen nodded, accepting the lie because it meant she was thinking clearly enough to protect herself. "Well, Sarah Morrison, you've had quite an adventure. Would you like to tell me how you ended up bleeding into my river?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Her hands moved instinctively to cover her throat, then stopped as memory reminded her that modesty was pointless when survival was at stake. I can't." "Then don't," Kaelen said gently. "There's no requirement that you explain yourself to me. I found you dying, so I brought you here to not die. Everything else is your business." His words seemed to surprise her more than kindness from a stranger should. She studied his face again, searching for the catch that experience had taught her always accompanied offers of help. When she couldn't find it, confusion replaced fear in her expression. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why what? Why help me? You don't know me, you don't owe me anything, and she gestured helplessly at her scarred body, "I'm not exactly a good investment." Kaelen was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer a question that cut straight to the heart of what it meant to be human. Outside wind whispered through pine branches with voices that sounded like his grandfather's stories. "My grandfather used to say that every person carries 2 wolves inside them," he said finally. "One wolf feeds on hatred, revenge, and cruelty. The other feeds on compassion, justice, and love. The wolf that grows strongest is the one you choose to feed every day." Her eyes never left his face as he spoke, and he saw something flicker in their depths, not quite hope, but maybe the memory of what hope had once felt like. "Which wolf are you feeding?" she asked. "I'm still deciding," he admitted, "but today helping you felt like the right choice." Silence settled between them like snow, soft and encompassing. In that quiet space, Sarah Morrison, if that was truly her name, seemed to reach some internal decision. The rigid tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though she remained coiled for flight, at the first sign of danger. "How long have I been here?" she asked. "About 8 hours. It's nearly sunset now." "And you've been—" She gestured vaguely at the bandages that covered most of her visible wounds. "Taking care of you. Yes, I have some medical training." He didn't mention that his education had come from battlefield surgery during conflicts that officially never happened, or that he'd learned to treat wounds like hers by seeing too many Apache women who'd suffered similar fates. Some truths were better left unspoken. "I should go," she said, though her body betrayed the impossibility of that plan by swaying when she tried to shift position. "I shouldn't stay here. It's not safe for you." "Why isn't it safe for me?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, as if she'd expected him to simply accept her warning without demanding explanations. Her hands twisted in the blanket that covered her, and Kaelen saw the telltale signs of someone wrestling with secrets too dangerous to share. "Because," she said finally, "the people who did this to me don't like loose ends, and they have long memories." "How long? What? How long do they remember?" "Because I've been hiding in these mountains for 3 years, and I've gotten quite good at making sure unwelcome visitors don't find what they're looking for." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully, seeing past the gentle healer to glimpse the warrior that lived beneath. For the first time since waking, her expression held something other than fear or pain, a flicker of curiosity about the man who'd pulled her back from death. "Why are you hiding?" she asked. Kaelen smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose we all have our reasons for running from the past. The question is whether we're running toward something better or just running because we don't know how to stop." Before she could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Horses, moving through the forest with the careful pace of men who knew they were trespassing on dangerous ground. Kaelen was on his feet and moving toward his rifle before the echo of hoofbeats fully registered. "How many people know you came this way?" he asked quietly, though his eyes never left the window. "No one," Sarah whispered, but her face had gone white as fresh snow. "I made sure no one followed me." "Then either you were wrong," Kaelen said, checking his rifle's load with practiced efficiency, "or they're better trackers than you thought." The sound of horses grew closer, and with it came voices, men calling to each other with the confidence of those who believed they held all the power. Kaelen caught fragments of conversation carried on the wind, enough to confirm what Sarah's terrified expression had already told him. They'd found her. "Listen to me," he said urgently, moving back to the bed where she struggled to sit up despite her injuries. "There's a cellar beneath the cabin. The entrance is hidden under the rug by the fireplace. Can you make it that far?" She nodded, though the movement clearly cost her. Kaelen helped her stand, his strong arms supporting her weight as they moved across the cabin's single room. Every step was agony for her, but she bit back any sound that might betray their position. "Whatever happens," he said as he lifted the rug to reveal a narrow wooden hatch, "you stay hidden until I come for you, or until you're certain I'm dead. Do you understand?" "Wait," she said, catching his arm with surprising strength. "You don't have to do this. You don't owe me anything. Just let them take me. I won't tell them you helped." Kaelen looked down at her upturned face, seeing in it an echo of every person who'd ever been taught that their life had no value beyond what others chose to give it. The rage he'd been holding in check since finding her began to burn hotter, not at her, but at a world that could break someone so thoroughly they'd beg to be abandoned to their tormentors. "No," he said simply. "That's not happening." "But no," he repeated, and this time she heard the Apache warrior in his voice, the man who'd learned to fight before he'd learned to heal. "You're under my protection now. That means something." Before she could argue further, he helped her down into the cellar, a space he'd carved from solid rock, as much for storage as for emergencies like this. It was dark and cramped, but it would hide her from casual search. "There's food and water down there," he said quietly. "And if something happens to me, There's a tunnel that leads out to the forest about 100 yards north. Can you remember that north? She nodded, though her eyes reflected the terror of someone who'd been abandoned to hunters before. Kaelen, she said, as he prepared to lower the hatch, be careful. These aren't ordinary men. Neither am I, he replied, and then she was gone, hidden beneath the floor, while he replaced the rug and prepared to meet whatever evil had followed her to his sanctuary. The voices outside grew clearer as the riders approached his cabin. 5 men from the sound of it, confident, experienced, the kind of men who made their living from other people's pain. Kaelen recognized the type he'd fought alongside them once before he'd learned the difference between justice and vengeance. A knock came at his door, polite and civilized, as if violence wasn't waiting just outside his threshold. "Hello, the cabin," called a voice with the cultured accent of Eastern education. "We're looking for someone who might have passed this way. Might we have a word?" Kaelen set his rifle within easy reach, but kept it out of immediate sight. In his experience, conversations that began with false courtesy often ended with genuine bloodshed. He opened the door to find 5 men mounted on horses that spoke of money and breeding. Their leader was a man in his 40s with silver-touched hair and eyes like winter ice. Despite the frontier setting, he wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than most men made in a year. "Gentlemen," Kaelen said evenly, "you're a long way from anywhere. Is there something I can help you with?" The leader dismounted with fluid grace, his hand resting casually on the butt of a Colt revolver that had seen recent use. "I certainly hope so. My name is Thaddeus Morrison, and I'm looking for my daughter. She's been missing for several days, and we have reason to believe she might have come this way." Morrison, the same last name Sarah had given him. Kaelen kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced with implications. If this man was truly her father, then the wounds on her body told a story darker than he'd imagined. "I haven't seen any women pass through here," Kaelen said truthfully. He'd found her, not seen her pass through. "This isn't exactly on the main road to anywhere." "No, it isn't," Morrison agreed, stepping closer to the cabin's entrance. "But my daughter has always been resourceful, particularly when she's running from consequences she doesn't want to face." Something in the man's tone made Kaelen's skin crawl. It was the voice of someone who'd perfected the art of making cruelty sound reasonable. "What kind of consequences?" Kaelen asked. Morrison's smile never reached his eyes. "The kind that come from ungrateful children who bite the hand that feeds them. But that's family business, I'm sure you understand." "I'm afraid I don't," Kaelen replied. "In my experience, family should be the one place where a person never has to earn their right to exist." For a moment, Morrison's carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing something cold and hungry underneath. How refreshingly naive. But then I suppose savages have different ideas about family obligation. The insult hung in the air between them like smoke from a poisoned fire. Kaelen felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had once made him dangerous to his enemies, and ultimately fatal to those he'd tried to protect. But 3 years of solitude had taught him that some battles were won by not fighting them. "Perhaps," he said mildly, "but savage or not, I can tell you with certainty that no woman has sought shelter here. I live alone and prefer it that way." Morrison studied his face with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading lies in other people's eyes. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him because he stepped back with a slight nod. "Well, then we won't take up any more of your time, but if you should happen to see a young woman, auburn hair, about 25, probably injured, I'd be very grateful if you'd send word to the Morrison Ranch outside Santa Fe. There would be a substantial reward for her safe return." "How substantial?" Kaelen asked, playing the role of a man whose poverty might outweigh his principles. $500, Morrison said, watching for Kaelen's reaction. It was an enormous sum, more money than most men saw in 5 years. The fact that Morrison was willing to pay it suggested that getting his daughter back was worth far more to him than simple paternal concern would justify. "That's quite a reward for a family reunion," Kaelen observed. "As I said, she's been ungrateful, but she's still my responsibility and I take care of what belongs to me." The way he said "belongs" made Kaelen's trigger finger itch. Below the cabin floor, Sarah Morrison waited in darkness, probably listening to every word and understanding that her father was here to drag her back to whatever hell she'd escaped from. "I'll keep my eyes open," Kaelen said finally. "If I see anything, I'll be sure to let you know." "No." Morrison nodded and remounted his horse with the same fluid grace he'd dismounted. His men had remained silent throughout the entire conversation, but Kaelen noticed they'd positioned themselves to cover all approaches to the cabin. These weren't ordinary ranch hands, they were professionals. "One more thing," Morrison said as he gathered his reins. "This young woman we're looking for, she's not well. Sometimes she tells stories that aren't true. Sometimes she makes accusations that can cause a lot of trouble for innocent people who try to help her." "What kind of accusations?" "The kind that get good men hanged for crimes they didn't commit. The kind that destroy reputations and families." Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, as if he'd had this conversation many times before. "I'd hate to see a decent man like yourself get caught up in her fantasies." With that, he spurred his horse away from the cabin, his men falling into formation around him like a military unit. They rode back the way they'd come, but Kaelen noticed that one of them, a lean man with the predatory stillness of a natural killer, kept looking back over his shoulder. Kaelen waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before retrieving Sarah from her hiding place. She emerged from the cellar like a ghost rising from its grave, her face white with terror and something that might have been shame. "You heard?" he asked. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "He's very convincing when he wants to be. Most people believe him." "What people believe and what's true aren't always the same thing," Kaelen said gently. "I've learned not to trust a man who needs to warn me about someone else's lies." "But what if—" "No," Kaelen interrupted. "Whatever stories he tells, whatever lies he's taught other people to believe about you, I know what I saw when I found you by that river. I know what those scars look like, and I know the difference between someone who's been saved and someone who's been punished." Sarah sank into the chair by the fire, her strength finally giving out completely. "He's my father," she said, and the words carried a weight that had nothing to do with blood relation and everything to do with ownership. "He owns the largest ranch in the territory. He has connections all the way to Washington. Who's going to believe a word I say against him?" "I will," Kaelen said simply. The certainty in his voice seemed to shock her more than her father's arrival had. She looked up at him with eyes that held years of accumulated disbelief, as if the concept of someone taking her word over Thaddeus Morrison's was literally unthinkable. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "You don't know what he's capable of." "Then tell me." For a moment she seemed to consider it. Her mouth opened as if words were fighting to escape, then closed again as fear reasserted its hold. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. "He'll come back," she said finally. "He always does, and when he does—" "When he does, we'll be ready," Kaelen replied. "This is my land, Sarah, my territory, and I've had 3 years to prepare for unwelcome visitors." Outside, the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Night was coming to the New Mexico mountains, and with it, the promise of decisions that would change everything for both of them. In the growing darkness, Sarah Morrison hugged her knees to her chest and tried to believe that sanctuary was possible. And Kaelen Blackhorse cleaned his rifle and prepared to discover whether 3 years of running from his own demons had prepared him to fight hers. The broken silence had been shattered. Now they would learn whether what emerged from the wreckage was salvation or something far more dangerous. Réessayer. The fire crackled in the stone hearth as darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Sarah sat in the worn leather chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of pine needle tea that Kaelen had brewed to help with the pain. The warmth felt foreign against her palm. She'd grown so accustomed to cold that simple comfort seemed almost threatening. "Tell me about the scars," Kaelen said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. His voice carried no judgment, only the patient tone of someone who understood that some stories couldn't be rushed. Sarah's fingers tightened around the cup. "Which ones?" "The old ones. The ones that healed before the recent ones were made." She was quiet for so long that he began to think she wouldn't answer. Outside, wind whispered through the pines with voices that sounded like prayers for the dead. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one had to be examined for hidden dangers before being released. "I was 16 when it started," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "My mother had been dead for 2 years, and my father, he said I looked too much like her, said it was unnatural the way I reminded him of what he'd lost." "What did he do?" "Small things at first. A slap when I laughed too loudly. A pinch when I wore a dress that he said was too much like one of hers. He called it correction, said he was teaching me not to be selfish with other people's grief." Kaelen felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen enough cruelty in his 32 years to recognize the pattern, how violence always began with justification, how abusers taught their victims to participate in their own destruction by making them believe they deserved it. "The first scar," Sarah continued, touching her left wrist, where a thin white line showed beneath the bandages, "came when I tried to visit my mother's grave on her birthday. He said I was being dramatic, attention-seeking. He took his pocket knife and—" She paused, swallowing hard. "He said if I wanted to mourn properly, I should understand what loss really felt like." "Jesus," Kaelen breathed. "The strange thing was," Sarah said with a bitter laugh that held no humor, "it worked. The physical pain was easier to understand than the grief. It had a beginning and an end. It was something I could endure and survive. So when he offered to help me process my emotions again, I didn't fight it. You were a child. You didn't know any better. I knew enough to know it was wrong, but I also knew that fighting back made it worse. And there was a part of me that—" She struggled with the words, her face twisting with shame. "There was a part of me that thought maybe he was right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I did deserve it." Kaelen had heard this before in the voices of Apache women who'd been broken by white soldiers in the confessions of warriors who'd been tortured into believing they were less than human. It was the most insidious part of sustained cruelty, the way it convinced victims that their suffering was somehow their fault. "How long?" he asked. 9 years. Until last week, when I finally found the courage to run." "What changed?" Sarah set down her cup with hands that trembled slightly. "He brought home a wife, a woman from back east, young and pretty and full of hope about her new life in the territories. Her name was Margaret. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, and she laughed like music. And within a month, she was wearing long sleeves in summer heat. Within 2 months, she stopped laughing altogether. Within 3 months, she was looking at me with the same expression I used to see in my mirror, the look of someone who's learned that survival means making yourself as small and invisible as possible." Kaelen watched Sarah's face as she spoke, seeing the way memory carved pain into her features. "You tried to help her. I tried to warn her, told her about the basement room where he kept his special knives, told her about the games he liked to play when he was teaching lessons about gratitude and respect. I thought," she laughed bitterly, "I thought if she knew what he was capable of, she'd leave before it got worse. But she didn't. She told him everything I'd said, every word. She went straight to him and reported our conversation like a good, dutiful wife seeking guidance from her husband." Sarah's voice turned flat, emotionless. That night he brought both of us down to the basement. He said it was time we learned about the consequences of spreading lies. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, like tiny souls escaping to heaven. Sarah watched them disappear into the darkness beyond the smoke hole, and Kaelen saw her hand move unconsciously to her ribs, where the worst of the recent knife work had been done. "That's when you got these new scars," he said. He was very creative, very thorough. Margaret begged him to stop after the first hour, promised she'd never listen to my lies again, swore she'd be the perfect wife he deserved. But by then, he was too far gone to hear her. "When he gets like that, when the anger takes hold of him," she shuddered, "it's like something else crawls inside his skin, something hungry." What happened to Margaret? She lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, he found her hanging from the chandelier in the parlor. She'd used bed sheets torn into strips, tied them around her neck, and kicked away the chair she'd stood on. Kaelen felt rage building in his chest, like a fire fed with gasoline. The image of a desperate woman choosing death over whatever Thaddeus Morrison had planned for her next session in his basement made him want to track the bastard down and introduce him to Apache justice. But he forced himself to remain still to listen, because Sarah needed to tell this story more than he needed to act on his anger. "He blamed me, of course," she continued. "Said my lies had driven his wife to despair. Said I'd murdered her as surely as if I'd tied the noose myself. That night he brought me back down to the basement and he—" She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "You don't have to tell me," Kaelen said gently. "No, I do. Because if you're going to risk your life protecting me, you need to understand what kind of man you're facing." She met his eyes directly for the first time since beginning her story. "He spent 6 hours working on me with his knives. 6 hours explaining in great detail how every cut was Margaret's blood on my hands, how every scar was justice for what I'd done to an innocent woman. But you survived. I survived because he wanted me to survive. The death wasn't the punishment the living was. He wanted me to carry those scars forever, to see them every time I looked in a mirror and remember that I was responsible for Margaret's death." "You weren't responsible, weren't I?" Sarah's voice rose slightly, carrying years of accumulated guilt. "If I hadn't told her about him, she might have found a way to live with whatever he did to her. Plenty of women do. They learn to endure, to adapt, to find small spaces of safety within the storm. But I took that possibility away from her. I forced her to see the truth, and the truth killed her." Kaelen leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes intense. "The truth didn't kill her, Sarah. He did. You gave her information that could have saved her life if she'd used it to run instead of staying to fight. The fact that she chose differently doesn't make her death your fault." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I've seen what real evil looks like, and I've learned to recognize the lies it tells to cover its tracks. Your father is a master manipulator. He's spent years teaching you to blame yourself for his actions, to carry the guilt that should be his alone. It's how men like him sleep at night, by convincing their victims that they somehow deserved what was done to them." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the deception that experience had taught her always lurked beneath offers of absolution. When she couldn't find it, confusion replaced the defensive anger in her expression. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. And helping me puts you in danger from a man who has more money and power than you can possibly imagine." Kaelen was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer a question that cut straight to the heart of who he'd chosen to become after his own world had collapsed. Outside, an owl called through the darkness with a voice that sounded like his grandfather's spirit, offering guidance from beyond the grave. "3 years ago," he said finally, "I was a different man. I worked for the territorial government, helping to negotiate treaties between Apache tribes and white settlers. I believed that violence could be ended through conversation, that understanding could bridge the gap between different worlds. What happened? I trusted the wrong people, believed their promises that this time would be different, that this treaty would actually be honored, instead of broken the moment it became inconvenient. His hands clenched into fists in his lap. I convinced my own people to sign agreements that gave up their ancestral lands in exchange for guarantees of safety and fair treatment on reservation land. Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes, a pain that ran as deep as her own, carved by betrayal, instead of blades, but no less scarring for its subtlety. The ink was barely dry on the treaty documents when the first attacks came, Kaelen continued. Soldiers arrived in the middle of the night claiming Apache raiders had violated the peace by stealing cattle from nearby ranches, but there had been no raids. The cattle had been moved before the soldiers arrived, hidden as evidence of crimes that never happened. They used you. They used my reputation, my relationships with tribal leaders, my promise that this time would be different. The Apache who'd trusted my word were rounded up like animals and marched to prison camps where they died of disease and starvation. The ones who tried to resist were shot down in front of their children as examples of what happened to savages who broke their word. And your family? Kaelen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My wife and daughter were among those who trusted my judgment. They believed me when I said the white man's law would protect them if they just followed the rules, if they just gave up their old ways and learned to live like civilized people. Where are they now? Dead. Both of them. My wife died of fever in the prison camp, and my daughter... He stopped his throat working as he struggled to get the words out. My daughter was 8 years old when they put a bullet in her head for the crime of trying to run back to her mother's grave. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She understood now why Kaelen had chosen solitude, why he'd built his cabin in a place where the outside world couldn't easily find him. He was carrying the same weight she was, the crushing guilt of survival when others had paid the price for trusting the wrong people. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt pitifully inadequate. I spent 2 years after that planning revenge, tracking down every man who'd been involved in the betrayal, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their families. I was going to make them pay for what they'd done, make them understand what it felt like to lose everything. But you didn't. No, because the night before I was going to start killing them, I had a dream about my daughter. She came to me as clear as if she were standing in this room, and she asked me a question that stopped me cold. What question? She asked me if making them suffer would bring her back. And when I said no, she asked if it would prevent other children from dying. When I couldn't answer that either, she asked me the hardest question of all. She asked if becoming like them would honor her memory or destroy it. Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes, though she couldn't have said whether they were for Kaelen's lost family or for the man who'd chosen to step back from the edge of becoming a monster. So you came here instead. I came here to learn how to live with the guilt without letting it poison everything I touched. I came here to figure out how to honor the dead without adding to their number. He looked at her with eyes that held depths of understanding she'd never expected to find in another person. And maybe I came here so that when someone like you needed help, I'd be ready to give it, even if it costs you everything. What do I have left to lose? This cabin, these mountains, my life. Kaelen shook his head. None of that matters compared to the chance to save someone who still has a future ahead of them. You don't know that I have a future. You don't know that I'm worth saving. I know that you ran when you could have given up. I know that you tried to warn another woman even though it meant terrible consequences for yourself. I know that you've survived 9 years of systematic torture without letting it break the part of you that still cares about other people's suffering. He leaned forward, his voice intense. That tells me everything I need to know about whether you're worth saving. Before Sarah could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Not horses this time, but something more subtle. The whisper of moccasined feet moving through dry leaves. the soft scrape of metal against wood, the almost inaudible murmur of men communicating through hand signals. Kaelen was on his feet instantly, moving toward the window with the fluid grace of a born hunter. He peered through a gap in the curtains, his body tense with controlled readiness. "How many?" Sarah whispered. "6, maybe 7. They're trying to surround the cabin." "It's him, isn't it?" He came back. "No." Kaelen's voice was grim. "These aren't your father's men. They move like Apache warriors, but they're carrying white man's weapons. Someone hired reservation Indians to do work that regular soldiers couldn't manage quietly." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water. "Hired them to do what?" "To make sure there are no witnesses to whatever story your father plans to tell about finding your body." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't just come looking for his escaped property. He'd come to eliminate the only person who could contradict his version of events. And he'd hired Apache trackers to make it look like a random raid, a tragic example of what happened to white settlers who ventured too far into dangerous territory. "What do we do?" she asked. Kaelen moved away from the window, his mind already working through possibilities and contingencies. "We fight, but not here. The cabin's too exposed, too easy to surround. We need to get to the forest where the darkness gives us an advantage. I can barely walk, let alone run through the wilderness in the dark." "Then I'll carry you." "That's suicide. You can't fight while carrying dead weight." "You're not dead weight." Kaelen was already gathering supplies, his rifle ammunition, a knife, a small pouch of medical supplies. "You're the reason we're fighting at all. And if we're smart about this, we won't have to fight much." A soft thud from the roof told them that at least one of their attackers had managed to climb onto the cabin. Soon they'd be surrounded, completely trapped like rabbits in a burrow, while predators gathered at every exit. "There's a back window that leads to the woodshed," Kaelen said quietly. "From there we can make it to the tree line before they realize we're gone, but we have to move now." Sarah tried to stand and immediately swayed her legs, refusing to support her weight. The blood loss and trauma of the past week had taken more out of her than she'd realized. Kaelen caught her before she could fall, his strong arms encircling her with surprising gentleness. "I've got you," he said. "Just hold on." He lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest while he moved toward the back of the cabin. Sarah could feel the controlled strength in his arms, the steady rhythm of his breathing, that spoke of a man who'd faced death before and learned not to let fear cloud his judgment. The back window opened silently. Kaelen had obviously kept it well-oiled for exactly this kind of emergency. He climbed through first, then reached back to help Sarah navigate the opening without aggravating her injuries. The woodshed provided temporary cover, but they both knew it wouldn't hide them for long. "The tree line is about 50 yards, Kaelen whispered. "Can you make it that far if I support you?" Sarah looked at the distance between the shed and the forest, measuring it against her current physical limitations. 50 yards might as well have been 50 miles, but the alternative was waiting to be found and killed. "I'll make it," she said. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, Kaelen's arm around Sarah's waist, providing both support and guidance. Every step was agony for her, but she bit back any sound that might give away their position. Behind them, she could hear the soft sounds of men positioning themselves around the cabin, preparing for an assault that would find empty rooms and cold ashes. The forest welcomed them with the embrace of deep shadows and familiar paths that only Kaelen knew. He led her deeper into the wilderness, away from the cabin and the men who'd come to kill them both. With each step, Sarah felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. Terror at the immediate danger, but relief at being away from the place where her father's reach had found her. "Where are we going?" she asked when they'd put enough distance between themselves and the cabin to risk quiet conversation. "There's a cave about half a mile from here, hidden, defensible, with multiple escape routes. We can wait there until morning, see how many of them are left after they discover we're not home. And then Then we decide whether we're running or making a stand." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of both choices. Running meant a life spent looking over her shoulder, never knowing when her father's money and influence would track her down again. Making a stand meant facing the possibility that they'd both die in these mountains, their bodies becoming food for carrion birds, while Thaddeus Morrison crafted whatever story he chose about their fate. "If we run," she said finally, "he'll never stop looking. He has the resources to chase us anywhere and the connections to make sure local law enforcement helps him do it." "I know. And if we make a stand, we're two people against an enemy who can hire as many killers as he needs." "I know that too. So what's the answer?" Kaelen was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he didn't have one. They continued through the forest in silence, his arms steady around her waist, his breathing controlled despite the physical demands of supporting her weight while navigating treacherous terrain in near total darkness. "My grandfather used to tell a story," he said finally, "about a rabbit who was being hunted by a pack of wolves. The rabbit could run, but the wolves were faster. The rabbit could hide, but the wolves could smell his fear. So the rabbit did something unexpected. He turned around and walked straight toward the largest wolf in the pack. What happened? The wolf was so surprised by the rabbit's boldness that he stopped to ask why a prey animal was approaching instead of fleeing. The rabbit said, 'Because I'm tired of running, and if I'm going to die, I want to choose how it happens.' And the wolf was so impressed by the rabbit's courage that he decided not to eat him. Instead, he made the rabbit his advisor because anyone brave enough to face certain death was worth keeping alive." Sarah considered the story as they walked, understanding its deeper meaning. "You're saying we should stop running and face him directly." "I'm saying that sometimes the only way to end a hunt is to turn hunter into hunted. Your father thinks he has all the power because he's always dictated the terms of engagement. He expects you to run and hide and cower while he slowly closes the net around you. What if we gave him something he doesn't expect? What did you have in mind?" A smile ghosted across Sarah's lips, the first genuine expression of anything other than pain or fear that Kaelen had seen from her. It transformed her face completely, revealing the woman she might have been if cruelty hadn't carved its lessons into her soul. "I think," she said, "it's time my father learned what happens when prey develops teeth." The cave Kaelen led her to was more than just a hiding place. It was a fortress carved from living rock by centuries of wind and water. The entrance was barely wide enough for one person hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines that would be invisible to searchers unless they knew exactly where to look. Inside, the space opened into a natural chamber, large enough for a dozen people, with passages that twisted deeper into the mountain's heart. "How did you find this place?" Sarah asked, as Kaelen helped her settle onto a bed of pine boughs. He'd obviously prepared for emergencies like this. "My grandfather showed it to me when I was 12. He said it was where our people came when the world above ground became too dangerous to survive in." Kaelen moved through the darkness with sure steps, lighting a small fire in a depression that had been worn smooth by countless previous uses. He called it the heart of the mountain, a place where the earth's spirit could protect those who honored the old ways. The fire cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, revealing ancient pictographs that spoke of hunts and ceremonies, battles and births, the eternal cycle of life that had played out in these mountains long before white men dreamed of manifest destiny. Sarah studied the primitive artwork, finding something oddly comforting in its reminder that others had faced seemingly impossible odds and survived to tell their stories. The passage in the back leads to 3 different exits. Kaelen continued, checking his rifle by firelight. One comes out about a quarter-mile north near a creek that runs toward Santa Fe. Another opens onto a ledge halfway up the mountain face, impossible to reach unless you know the handholds, but it gives you a clear view of everything below. The third, he paused, his expression growing grim. The third leads where, Sarah prompted. to a place my people considered sacred, where warriors went when they needed to speak with the spirits of the dead before making decisions that would determine the fate of the living. And what did the spirits usually tell them? That some fights are worth dying for, and some enemies deserve whatever justice the living can deliver. Sarah watched the play of firelight across his angular features, seeing in them the echo of countless generations who'd faced impossible choices in this very place. You're thinking about your wife and daughter. I'm thinking about what they would want me to do, whether saving you honors their memory or just postpones the inevitable. What do you think they'd say? Kaelen was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes focused on something beyond the cave walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. My daughter used to ask me why some people chose to hurt others when they could choose to help instead. I never had a good answer for her then, but I think she'd say that the choice itself matters more than the outcome, that becoming the kind of person who helps others in danger is worth the risk of failing, even if it costs you your life, especially then, because what's the point of living if you're not willing to risk death for something that matters? Before Sarah could respond, the sound of voices echoed from somewhere outside the cave, distant but growing closer. Their pursuers had discovered the abandoned cabin and were now spreading out to search the surrounding forest. Through the cave's entrance, they could see the faint glow of torches moving through the trees like angry fireflies. They're good, Kaelen admitted grudgingly. Better than I expected. It won't take them long to pick up our trail. How long do we have? Maybe an hour before they find the cave entrance. Less if they brought dogs. Did you hear dogs? No, but that doesn't mean they're not there. Sarah struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the way the movement sent fire through her healing wounds. Tell me about the man who's leading them, the one you saw at the cabin. What about him? Everything. How he moved, how he spoke, how he looked at you. My father chooses his people very carefully. They're all broken in specific ways that make them useful to him. Kaelen thought back to the brief confrontation outside his cabin, remembering details he'd filed away without conscious thought. The leader was Apache, but not reservation Apache. He moved like someone who'd grown up free in the mountains, learned to hunt and fight the old way. But there was something else. What? Anger. Deep personal anger that went beyond whatever your father was paying him. This wasn't just a job for him, it was revenge. Sarah's face went pale in the firelight. Was he about your age? Tall, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. You know him. If it's who I think it is, his name is Joseph Crow Feather. He worked for my father 2 years ago when there was trouble with Apache raids on the ranch's outer buildings. Father hired him to negotiate with the tribal leaders, promised him good pay and fair treatment for his people. What happened? The raids weren't real. Father had his own men steal the cattle and burn the buildings, then blamed it on the Apache to justify calling in federal troops. Joseph discovered the deception and tried to expose it, but she shrugged helplessly. Who was going to believe an Indian's word against Thaddeus Morrison's? So your father destroyed him. Worse, he had Joseph arrested for the thefts he'd arranged himself. Joseph spent 6 months in territorial prison before the charges were quietly dropped, but by then his reputation was ruined. No one would hire him, no one would trust him. The Apache called him a fool for believing white man's promises, and the whites called him a criminal. Kaelen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Your father broke him deliberately, made him desperate enough to take any work that was offered. It's what he does. He finds people's weaknesses and exploits them until they become useful. Joseph probably thinks killing us will somehow restore his honor, prove his loyalty to someone who'll actually pay him. He's wrong. Of course he's wrong. But desperation makes people believe things they know aren't true, and my father is very good at offering hope to people who've forgotten what it looks like. The voices outside were getting closer now, accompanied by the systematic sound of searchers working their way through the forest. Kaelen moved to the cave entrance and peered through the hanging vines, counting torches and estimating numbers. 8 men, he reported quietly. Moving in formation, checking every possible hiding place. They'll reach this area within the hour. Can we get to one of the other exits before they find us? Maybe, but that just postpones the inevitable. They'll track us down eventually, and next time we might not have such good ground to defend. Sarah studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the way his jaw was set with grim determination. You're not planning to run, are you? I'm planning to end this tonight, one way or another. Against 8 trained killers, that's suicide. Maybe, but it's suicide on my terms, in a place where I have every advantage the terrain can give me. Kaelen turned back to face her, his eyes reflecting the flames like mirrors of controlled fury. Besides, they're not expecting resistance. They think they're hunting a wounded woman and the soft-hearted fool who took her in. You're not soft-hearted. No, but I've spent 3 years letting people think I was. Sometimes the best weapon is an enemy's assumptions about your weakness. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what he was suggesting. You want to use me as bait. I want to use their expectations against them. They think you're helpless, that I'm protecting you out of misguided charity. What if we showed them something different? What did you have in mind? Kaelen moved deeper into the cave, returning with items he'd obviously cached here for emergencies. A spare rifle, ammunition, knives, supplies that spoke of a man who'd learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for better. My grandfather used to say that the most dangerous animal in the forest was the one that looked already dead. Predators expect prey to run, to hide, to submit. They don't expect it to turn around and attack with nothing left to lose. You want us to hunt them instead of letting them hunt us. But I want us to remind them that survival isn't just about being stronger or faster or better armed. Sometimes it's about being willing to do things your enemy isn't prepared for. Sarah accepted the knife he offered her, testing its weight in her hand. The blade was perfectly balanced, sharp enough to split hair, and heavy enough to do serious damage in the right hands. It felt strange to hold a weapon after years of being defenseless, but not unwelcome. I should warn you, she said, I'm not exactly in fighting condition. You don't need to be. You just need to be willing to draw blood when the opportunity presents itself. Oh, I'm willing. I've been willing for 9 years. I just never had the chance before. The hatred in her voice was cold and pure, distilled from years of helpless rage into something sharp enough to cut. Kaelen recognized it because he'd carried the same poison in his own heart after his family's murder. The difference was that Sarah's hatred was still focused, still useful, while his had nearly consumed him before he'd learned to transmute it into something more constructive. There's something you need to understand, he said carefully. Once we start this, there's no going back. Your father's men won't be content to capture you alive anymore. They'll kill you rather than risk you escaping again, and they'll make sure I die slowly as an example of what happens to people who interfere with Morrison business. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about fighting back anymore. This is about survival, which means we do whatever it takes to make sure we're the ones left standing when the sun comes up. No mercy, no hesitation, no second chances for people who wouldn't give us any. Sarah met his eyes across the small fire, and he saw something there that hadn't been present before. Not just determination, but a cold calculation that spoke of someone who'd finally stopped seeing herself as a victim and started seeing herself as a predator. Good, she said simply. I'm tired of being afraid. The sound of voices was much closer now, close enough to make out individual words carried on the mountain wind. Joseph Crowfeather's voice rose above the others, giving orders in English mixed with Apache, coordinating the search with military precision. They're splitting up, Kaelen observed, listening to the pattern of commands. 2 groups of 4 moving to cover more ground. That's good for us, easier to deal with smaller numbers. Which group gets Joseph? The one that finds us first, I'd imagine. He strikes me as the type who likes to handle important business personally. Sarah shifted position, testing her mobility against the constraints of her injuries. She was far from healed, but adrenaline and fury were powerful medicine. If she was careful, if she was smart about conserving her strength, she might be able to contribute more than just moral support to whatever was about to happen. "Tell me about the cave layout again," she said. "Every passage, every advantage we can use." Kaelen sketched the cave system in the dirt beside the fire, showing her the main chamber where they sat, the 3 escape routes, and the narrow choke points where a small number of defenders could hold off a larger force. As he talked, Sarah studied the crude map with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. "This passage here," she said, pointing to the route that led to the mountain ledge. "How defensible is it? Very single-file access, blind corners, lots of places to set up ambushes, but it's also a potential trap, only one way in or out. What if we used that to our advantage? Let them think we're trapped, then hit them when they're bunched up in the narrow spaces. Risky. If we miss our chance or they bring more men than we can handle, we're finished. As opposed to the no-risk option of hiding in here until they smoke us out." Kaelen smiled grimly. "Point taken. You're thinking like a warrior, not a victim. I'm thinking like someone who's tired of letting other people decide whether I live or die." Outside, the search was intensifying. Torch beams swept across the cave entrance with increasing frequency, and it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the hanging vines that concealed their refuge. Whatever they were going to do, they needed to do it soon. "All right," Kaelen said, making his decision. "We make our stand in the upper passage. I'll take point, you cover our retreat route in case things go badly. When they come for us, we make every shot count and give them a fight they'll remember. Assuming any of them survive to remember it. Assuming we survive to care whether they remember it or not." They began gathering their weapons and supplies, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their next few hours would determine whether they saw another sunrise. Sarah found that her body was responding better than she'd expected. Pain was still there, but it had become background noise compared to the fierce anticipation of finally being able to strike back at her tormentors. "Sarah," Kaelen said as they prepared to move deeper into the cave system, "whatever happens tonight, whatever we have to do to survive, don't let it change who you are underneath. The moment you start enjoying the violence, you become like them. And if I already am like them, if 9 years of systematic torture turned me into something just as cruel as my father, then you wouldn't have tried to save Margaret. You wouldn't have risked everything to warn someone you barely knew about the danger she was in." He touched her shoulder gently, his hand warm through the thin fabric of her torn dress. "Cruelty creates more cruelty, but so does kindness. The fact that you still care about other people's suffering means the part of you that matters is still intact." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been where you are now. I've stood at the edge of the abyss and looked into it long enough to understand what it would cost me to jump. The choice to step back, to find another way, that's what separates us from them." A shout from outside cut through their conversation like a blade. Someone had found something, tracks, disturbed vegetation, or maybe just the intuition that comes from years of hunting dangerous prey. The search was about to become a siege. "Time to go," Kaelen said, shouldering his rifle and gathering the medical supplies they couldn't afford to leave behind. As they moved deeper into the cave system, following passages that twisted through the mountain's heart like arteries through a sleeping giant, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The fierce joy of having choices again. Not good choices, not safe choices, but choices nonetheless. The choice to fight instead of submit, to risk death rather than accept captivity, to finally meet violence with violence and see which side wanted victory more. Behind them, torchlight began to flicker through the cave entrance as their pursuers discovered the hidden refuge. Voices echoed through the stone passages, distorted by distance and acoustics, into something that sounded like the whispers of hunting ghosts. "This way," Kaelen said, leading her toward the passage that would take them to the mountain ledge. "Stay close, watch your footing, and remember, we're not running anymore. We're positioning ourselves for the kill." The passage narrowed as they climbed, forcing them into single file through corridors barely wide enough for their shoulders. The walls pressed close on either side, worn smooth by centuries of water flow, while the ceiling dropped low enough that Kaelen had to duck in places. It was exactly the kind of terrain that could turn a superior force into a liability, where numbers meant nothing and local knowledge meant everything. "How much farther?" Sarah whispered as they navigated a particularly tight squeeze. "Another 100 yards. The passage opens onto a ledge about 30 feet wide with a clear view of the approaches. From there, we can see them coming long before they can see us. And if they decide to wait us out instead of attacking, then we wait too. But men like that don't get paid for patience. They'll come for us probably sooner rather than later." The passage began to brighten as they approached the exit, moonlight filtering through the opening like liquid silver. The ledge beyond was everything Kaelen had promised, a natural fortification that commanded the approaches while providing multiple firing positions and cover from return fire. Sarah settled behind a boulder that gave her a clear view of the passage they'd just climbed, her knife ready in one hand while she tried to control her breathing. The climb had cost her more than she'd wanted to admit, but she was still functional, still able to contribute to whatever was about to happen. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. "Not long. They'll find the cave entrance within minutes, and once they realize we're not in the main chamber, they'll start checking the other passages." "Will they all come this way?" "Probably not. Joseph's too smart to commit all his men to one route. He'll send half this way and keep the others watching the other exits in case we try to double back. So we're looking at 4 men instead of 8. 4 trained killers who know these mountains almost as well as I do, led by a man who has every reason to want us dead." Kaelen checked his rifle one final time, making sure every round was seated properly. "But 4 is better than 8, and we have the high ground. My father always said that wars are won by whoever wants victory more than they fear death. Your father was right about that at least. The question is, do we want to live more than they want us dead?" Sarah considered the question as she watched the passage entrance, waiting for the first signs of their pursuers. Below them, torchlight flickered through the forest like fireflies as the search intensified. Soon, very soon, violence would climb through the stone passages toward them, and they would learn whether desperation and fury were enough to overcome superior numbers and professional training. "I don't know if I want to live," she said finally, "but I know I want them to pay for what they've done. And if that means dying to make sure they don't hurt anyone else, then that's a price I'm willing to pay." Kaelen nodded grimly. "Then we're ready for whatever comes next." The first sound of pursuit echoed through the passage below them, the scrape of boots on stone, the whisper of clothing against narrow walls, the controlled breathing of men who hunted other humans for a living. Joseph Crowfeather's voice drifted up from the depths, speaking in Apache to his companions, coordinating their approach with tactical precision. "Here they come," Kaelen murmured, settling into firing position behind his chosen cover. Sarah gripped her knife tighter and prepared to meet her father's killers, with teeth bared and blood in her eyes. The broken silence was about to become a roar of gunfire and death, and when it was over, only one side would be left to tell the story of what happened in the heart of the mountain where spirits of the dead whispered advice to the living. The hunt was about to become a war. The first shadow appeared at the passage mouth like smoke given form, moving with the careful deliberation of a predator testing unknown ground. Joseph Crowfeather emerged into the moonlight with his rifle raised, his eyes scanning the ledge with methodical precision. Behind him, 3 other shapes materialized from the darkness, spreading out to cover different angles of approach. Kaelen held his breath, finger resting lightly on his rifle's trigger as he watched the men position themselves. They moved like soldiers, like warriors who'd learned their craft through blood and bitter experience. But they also moved like men who expected to be hunting cornered prey, not facing an ambush from offenders who'd chosen their ground carefully. "I know you're up there," Joseph called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls with eerie resonance. "There's nowhere left to run, Morrison woman. Come down peacefully, and your death will be quick." Sarah pressed herself closer to her boulder, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The casual way he spoke about her death, as if it were already accomplished fact, sent rage coursing through her veins like liquid fire. "My father taught you well," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the moonlit space. "Promising mercy you have no intention of delivering." Joseph's head snapped toward the sound of her voice, but the acoustic properties of the ledge made it impossible to pinpoint her exact location. "Your father didn't teach me anything except what happens when you trust white man's promises, but I learned that lesson thoroughly. Did you learn it thoroughly enough to know he's lying to you now?" A pause. Then Joseph's bitter laugh floated up from below. What lies could he possibly tell that would matter now? "You're going to die tonight regardless of what promises were made or broken. The lie that killing me will restore your honor. The lie that doing his dirty work will somehow make him respect you." Sarah shifted position slightly, keeping her voice mobile to prevent them from getting a fix on her location. "You know what you are to him. You're a tool, a broken Indian he can use and discard when you're no longer useful." "Shut up." Joseph's voice carried a dangerous edge, the controlled anger of a man who'd been nursing wounds too deep to heal properly. "You don't know anything about honor or respect. You're just a spoiled white girl who never learned to appreciate what she had." "What I had?" Sarah's laugh was as bitter as his had been. "I had 9 years of systematic torture at the hands of a man who called it love. I had cigarette burns and knife cuts and nights spent praying for death because it seemed kinder than another day of his lessons. Is that what you think I should have appreciated? Lies." But there was uncertainty in Joseph's voice now, a crack in the certainty that had driven him up the mountain. "Morrison said you were ungrateful, that you made up stories to get attention." "Look at me, Joseph." Sarah stood up slowly, letting the moonlight illuminate her scarred arms and face. "Look at what he did to his own daughter and tell me these are lies." Even from 30 feet away, the evidence of systematic abuse was unmistakable. The careful pattern of old scars, the precision of recent knife work, the burn marks that could only have been made deliberately over an extended period. Joseph's rifle wavered slightly as he processed what he was seeing. "Jesus Christ," one of his companions whispered. "What kind of monster?" "The kind who's paying us to clean up his mistakes," another man said harshly. "The kind who'll hunt us down if we don't finish the job." "But if she's telling the truth..." "The truth doesn't matter," Joseph said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We took his money. We gave our word. A man's word is all he has left when everything else is gone." Kaelen chose that moment to act his rifle, speaking with deadly authority from an unexpected angle. The shot took Joseph's nearest companion in the chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling off the narrow ledge into the darkness below. Before the echo of the gunshot faded, Kaelen had already moved to a new position, making himself a difficult target for return fire. "3 left," he called out grimly. "Anyone else want to discuss the philosophy of keeping your word to monsters?" Joseph and his remaining men had taken cover behind the scattered boulders that littered the passage entrance, their rifles trained on the shadows where they thought their attackers might be hiding. But Kaelen had spent 3 years learning every inch of this terrain, and he used that knowledge now with lethal efficiency. "You made a mistake coming here," Joseph called out, trying to locate his hidden enemy. "This is Apache land. You don't know it well enough to fight us on it." "Funny thing about that," Kaelen replied from a position 20 feet from where his voice had been moments before. "I am Apache. Mescalero band born in these mountains, taught to hunt and fight by my grandfather before your people were driven onto reservations." "Impossible," Morrison said. "Morrison says a lot of things. Most of them lies designed to get other people to do his killing for him." Kaelen's second shot took another of Joseph's men, this one through the shoulder, sending him sprawling behind inadequate cover, while his blood painted the stone black in the moonlight. "Two left," Sarah observed with grim satisfaction. "How does it feel to be outnumbered, Joseph?" The wounded man was crying out in pain, his voice echoing through the mountain passages like the wail of a lost soul. His companion tried to reach him to provide aid or at least comfort, but Kaelen's third shot discouraged the attempt by putting a bullet inches from the would-be rescuer's head. "Let me help him," the man called out desperately. "He's bleeding to death." "Should have thought of that before you came hunting innocent people," Sarah replied coldly. "Now you know what it feels like to watch someone you care about suffer while you're powerless to help." "We didn't know," Joseph said, and for the first time his voice carried something other than anger or certainty. "Morrison told us you'd killed his wife, that you were dangerous, that you'd already murdered one man who tried to help you." "His wife killed herself rather than endure another day of his attention, and the only man who tried to help me is standing right there with a rifle, very much alive and very angry about people who hunt women for money." The wounded man's cries were growing weaker, his lifeblood seeping out onto the cold stone, despite his companion's desperate attempts to stem the flow. The sound of his suffering seemed to affect Joseph in ways that rational argument hadn't, cracking the shell of professional detachment that had carried him this far. "This isn't what we signed up for," the unwounded man said to Joseph, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't hunting criminals or enforcing justice. This is just murder." "I know," Joseph replied, and the defeat in his voice was complete. "I know what this is. I've known since we found the cabin and saw how carefully everything had been prepared. Men who are hunting dangerous fugitives don't bring along supplies for burning bodies and hiding evidence. Then why did we come? Because I'm tired of being hungry, tired of being unwanted, tired of watching my children grow thinner every day because no one will hire a disgraced Apache who trusted the wrong white man." Joseph's voice broke slightly. "I thought maybe if I did this one job, proved my loyalty one more time, someone would finally give me a chance to earn an honest living. And now I know that men like Morrison don't give chances. They just find new ways to use people until they're broken beyond repair." Kaelen had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. He recognized the desperation in Joseph's voice, the hollow echo of a man who'd lost everything and been offered one last chance to reclaim some small piece of dignity. It was the same desperation that had nearly driven him to become a killer 3 years ago. "Joseph," he called out, his voice carrying a different tone than before. "What's your real name? Not the white man's version, but the name your grandmother gave you when you were born." There was a long pause before the answer came. "Stands Against Thunder. It was my grandfather's name before it was mine." "Stands Against Thunder. This is Walks Between Worlds speaking. My grandfather was Gray Eagle of the Mescalero band. Do you know that name?" Another pause, longer this time. "Gray Eagle, who spoke for peace with the cavalry. Gray Eagle, who saved 3 villages by negotiating safe passage during the winter of bad snows. The same man. He raised me after my parents died, taught me the old ways and the new ones, showed me how to live in both worlds without losing my soul to either. What does this matter now? We're past the point of talking our way out of this. Maybe, but before more blood is spilled, I want you to understand something. The man who hired you, the man whose word you're dying to keep, he's the same man who destroyed my family. 3 years ago, he used my reputation and my grandfather's name to convince Apache leaders to sign a treaty that was never meant to be honored. When they trusted me and signed his papers, federal troops slaughtered them like animals." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah saw understanding dawn in Joseph's posture, saw the way his shoulders sagged as the final pieces of a terrible puzzle fell into place. "Your wife and daughter," Joseph said quietly. "They were at Thunder Creek when the soldiers came." "You were there. I was one of the scouts who found the bodies afterward. I helped bury what was left of them." Joseph's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Your daughter, she couldn't have been more than 8 years old." "She was 8. Her name was Little Hawk, and she wanted to be a healer like her grandfather. She was learning to identify medicinal plants when Morrison's soldiers put a bullet in her head." The wounded man had stopped crying out his lifeblood, finally exhausted on the unforgiving stone. His companion knelt beside the body, weeping silently for a friend whose name he might never have known, whose children would grow up wondering why their father never came home. "I'm sorry," Joseph said, and the words carried the weight of genuine remorse. "I didn't know. If I had known who you were, what Morrison had taken from you, what would you have done differently? I would have killed him myself and saved you the trouble." Sarah listened to this exchange with growing amazement. She was witnessing something she'd never thought possible. 2 men who'd been prepared to kill each other moments before, finding common ground in their shared suffering at her father's hands. "It's not too late," she called out. "You still have a choice, Joseph. You can finish the job Morrison hired you for, or you can help us make sure he never destroys another family. Help you how he has money power connections all the way to Washington. We're just 3 people with guns and anger." "Sometimes that's enough," Kaelen said. "Sometimes the only thing tyrants really fear is people who have nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear." "And what about afterward? If we somehow survive this, if we somehow manage to bring down Thaddeus Morrison, what then? Where do we go? How do we live?" It was Sarah who answered, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "We go wherever we choose. We live however we want. Because for the first time in our lives, we'll be free of his shadow." Joseph was quiet for a long time, wrestling with a decision that would determine not just his immediate survival, but the kind of man he would be for whatever years remained to him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a choice made with full knowledge of its consequences. "Thomas," he said to his surviving companion, "put down your rifle." "Joseph, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done years ago. Something my grandfather would have done if he'd been brave enough to see the truth about the men he was trying to make peace with." The sound of rifles being set down echoed through the mountain passage, followed by the soft shuffle of men emerging from cover with their hands visible and empty. Joseph Crow, feather stands against thunder, stepped into the moonlight like a man emerging from a long, dark dream. "If we're going to do this," he said, looking up toward where Kaelen and Sarah waited, "we need to do it right. Morrison isn't just one man, he's a network of corruption that reaches into every level of territorial government. Taking him down will require more than just killing him." "What are you suggesting?" Kaelen asked, though he remained in position with his rifle ready. Trust was a commodity that had to be earned through actions, not words. "I'm suggesting we give him exactly what he's been giving other people all these years. I'm suggesting we make him afraid." Sarah stood up fully now, her knife still in her hand, but no longer raised in immediate threat. "How do we make a man like that afraid?" "By taking away the thing he values most. Not his money, he can always make more. Not his reputation, he's survived scandals before, but his control, his certainty that he can manipulate people and events to serve his purposes." Joseph's smile was sharp as a blade. "We make him powerless, and then we make him pay for every life he's destroyed." "That's a dangerous game," Kaelen warned. "Men like Morrison don't go down quietly. They take as many people with them as they can." "Then we make sure we're not among the people he takes," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that made both men look at her more carefully. "We make sure that when this is over, he's the only one who pays the price for what he's done." The wounded man's blood had stopped flowing, his body still and cold, in the mountain air that carried the scent of pine and stone and death. His sacrifice had bought them this moment of understanding, this chance to choose alliance over enmity, cooperation over mutual destruction. "There's something else you need to know," Joseph said as he climbed up to join them on the ledge. "Morrison didn't just send us after you. He's mobilizing every resource he has, bounty hunters, corrupt lawmen, federal marshals he has in his pocket. By morning, there will be wanted posters for both of you in every town between here and the Mexican border." "What are the charges?" Kaelen asked. "Murder, kidnapping, rape, theft, conspiracy against the territorial government. Enough crimes to justify hanging you both without trial if you're taken alive." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "He's making sure that even if we escape, we'll never be able to live normal lives anywhere in the territories. That's the idea. He wants you running scared, always looking over your shoulders, never able to rest or trust anyone. It's his favorite kind of revenge, slow psychological torture that destroys people from the inside out." "Unless we destroy him first," Kaelen said quietly. "Unless we destroy him first," Joseph agreed. "But that means striking soon before he has time to solidify his story and turn public opinion completely against you." "How soon?" "Tomorrow night. There's a gathering at his ranch. Territorial legislators, federal officials, wealthy ranchers from across the Southwest. He's hosting a celebration to announce his engagement to another young woman from back east." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Another wife, another victim. Her name is Catherine Whitmore, 22 years old, from a prominent Boston family that's fallen on hard times. Morrison promised her father a substantial investment in his shipping business in exchange for his daughter's hand. She has no idea what she's walking into. None. And if Morrison follows his usual pattern, she'll be dead within 6 months. Suicide, of course, brought on by the strain of frontier life and an unfortunate tendency toward melancholy. The picture Joseph painted was so coldly calculated, so methodically evil, that it took Sarah's breath away. Her father wasn't just a man who'd lost control of his darker impulses. He was a predator who'd turned the destruction of innocent lives into a systematic business model. "We have to stop him," she said, and her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who'd finally found a purpose worth dying for. Not just for us, but for her, for all the women who'll come after her, if we don't end this now. "Agreed," Kaelen said, "but how do we get close enough to Morrison to do any damage? He'll have guards, hired killers, probably half the territorial militia, if he thinks he's in danger." "We don't get close to him," Joseph said with a smile that was all teeth. "We make him come to us. How? By taking the one thing he values more than his own life. By taking his reputation and feeding it to the carrion birds, piece by bloody piece." As the three unlikely allies stood together on the mountain ledge where moments before they'd been prepared to kill each other, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 9 years. Hope. Not the desperate, hollow hope of escape, but the fierce, burning hope of justice, finally within reach. Below them, the forest stretched away into darkness, hiding secrets and sheltering the desperate. Above them, stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering but somehow comforting in their eternal presence. And around them, the mountain itself seemed to pulse with approval, as if the spirits of the dead were finally ready to see their long-delayed revenge enacted. The hunt had become an alliance. Now it would become a reckoning that would either restore balance to a world gone mad with cruelty or destroy them all in the attempt. But for the first time since she'd run bleeding into the wilderness, Sarah Morrison felt like the outcome was finally in her own hands. The descent from the mountain ledge took place in the pre-dawn darkness, 3 figures moving like ghosts, through terrain that seemed eager to help them disappear. Joseph led the way with the sure-footed confidence of a man born to these heights, while Kaelen supported Sarah when the steep path challenged her still-healing wounds. Thomas, Joseph's surviving companion, brought up the rear, his rifle ready and his eyes constantly scanning for pursuit that never came. "The other team will have heard the shots," Thomas said quietly, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of loose scree. "They'll be looking for us." "Let them look," Joseph replied without slowing his pace. "By the time they organize a proper search, we'll be 20 miles away with a 12-hour head start." "Where exactly are we going?" Sarah asked, pausing to catch her breath against a boulder that offered temporary shelter from the mountain wind. "There's an abandoned mining camp about 3 hours north of here. Silver played out 5 years ago, but the buildings are still sound, and there's fresh water from an underground spring. More importantly, it's isolated enough that we can plan without worrying about unwelcome visitors." "And after we plan, what then?" Joseph turned to look at her, his weathered face serious in the starlight. "Then we go to war against your father, not the kind of war fought with armies and artillery, but the kind fought with truth and consequences, the kind that destroys a man's power by exposing the rot beneath his carefully constructed image." They resumed their careful descent, each lost in private thoughts about what lay ahead. Sarah found herself thinking about Catherine Whitmore, the unsuspecting young woman who was walking into the same trap that had claimed Margaret's life. The urgency of saving her gave purpose to the pain that shot through Sarah's body, with every step transforming suffering into fuel for the justice that was finally within reach. "Tell me about this gathering," she said, when they'd reached more level ground. "How many people, what kind of security, where exactly does it take place?" 150 guests. "Maybe more," Joseph replied. "Politicians, businessmen, military officers, society wives from Santa Fe and Albuquerque, the kind of people who matter in territorial politics. Security, 20 armed guards at least. Professional gunmen disguised as ranch hands, plus whatever federal marshals Morrison has in his pocket. The main house will be locked down tight with guards at every entrance and patrols covering the grounds." Kaelen absorbed this information with the calculating mind of someone who'd planned similar operations during his government days. What about the woman? Where will they be keeping her? Probably in the guest wing under the pretext of propriety before the wedding, but knowing Morrison, she'll be watched constantly. He won't risk his new prize escaping before he's had time to properly break her. "So we're looking at a fortress full of armed men surrounded by Morrison's allies, with our primary objective locked away under heavy guard." Sarah's voice carried grim humor. "I'm starting to see why you think this requires more than a direct assault." "The direct assault comes later," Joseph said with a predatory smile. "First, we give Morrison's guests a show they'll never forget. Something that reveals exactly what kind of man they've been doing business with." Thomas, who'd been listening in thoughtful silence, finally spoke up. "What kind of show?" "The kind that involves Morrison's private basement. The kind that lets those upstanding citizens see his collection of knives and chains and bloodstained tables. The kind that makes them understand they've been breaking bread with a monster." The mining camp materialized from the darkness, like something from a fever dream, its empty buildings standing sentinel over played-out claims and abandoned dreams. The main structure had been a company office, solidly built from local stone and timber, designed to withstand both weather and the occasional territorial dispute over mineral rights. Smaller buildings scattered around it had housed workers, equipment, and supplies for an operation that had once employed over 200 men. Now it was a ghost town populated only by wind and memories and the 3 fugitives who'd come here to plan the destruction of Thaddeus Morrison. "There's canned food in the supply building," Joseph said, as they explored their temporary refuge. "Basic medical supplies, too, left behind when the company pulled out. We can hold up here for a day or two while we work out the details." Sarah settled onto a wooden crate near the stone fireplace, grateful for the chance to rest properly for the first time since fleeing her father's ranch. The pain in her ribs was a constant reminder of recent trauma, but it no longer dominated her thoughts. Something stronger had taken its place, a cold, focused determination that felt like armor against both physical discomfort and emotional despair. "I want to know everything about the basement," she said without preamble. "Every room, every piece of equipment, every detail that will shock those respectable people into understanding what kind of man they've been supporting." Joseph and Thomas exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of her thoughts. Sarah," Kaelen said gently, "you don't need to relive those memories. We can figure out another way to expose him." "No, we can't. Because those people downstairs, those politicians and businessmen and society wives, they'll listen to rumors and dismiss them as gossip. They'll hear accusations and write them off as the desperate lies of criminals trying to avoid justice. But they won't be able to dismiss physical evidence. They won't be able to ignore what they see with their own eyes." "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we invite Morrison's guests on a guided tour of hell. I'm proposing we show them the room where he kept Margaret chained to the wall for 3 days before she died. I'm proposing we let them see the table where he carved lessons into my skin while explaining how each cut was an act of love." The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through empty buildings and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Joseph stared at her with something that might have been admiration, while Thomas looked frankly horrified at the implications of what she was suggesting. "You're talking about forcing them to witness torture," Thomas said finally. "Even if it's evidence of past crimes, even if it serves justice, that's not something decent people should have to see." "Decent people." Sarah's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "These aren't decent people, Thomas. These are the men and women who've looked the other way while my father destroyed lives for profit. These are the politicians who've taken his money, and the businessmen who've partnered with him, and the society wives who've gossiped about his victims without ever bothering to ask if the stories might be true." "She's right," Kaelen said quietly. "Evil thrives when good people choose not to see it. Sometimes the only way to force people to confront the truth is to make ignorance impossible." "But the risk is worth taking," Joseph interrupted, "because if we succeed, if we manage to expose Morrison in front of all those witnesses, it won't just destroy him. It'll destroy the network of corruption that's allowed him to operate with impunity for so many years." They spent the next several hours working out the details of what they were calling, with grim humor, the revelation plan. The basic concept was audacious in its simplicity: infiltrate the party's separate key witnesses from the main gathering and force them to confront evidence of Morrison's crimes that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. "The basement entrance is through the kitchen," Sarah explained, sketching a rough map of the house layout in the dirt floor. "There's a hidden door behind the pantry shelves that leads to a narrow staircase. Morrison had it built that way so he could bring victims down without the household staff knowing what was happening. How many people know about it? Besides him, maybe 3 or 4 of his most trusted men, the kind who help with the dirty work in exchange for generous payment and absolute silence. Guards. Not usually. He's arrogant enough to believe that no one would dare investigate his private spaces, and even if they did, he's confident that his reputation would protect him from serious consequences. That arrogance is going to be his downfall," Kaelen observed. "Men who think they're untouchable often forget to protect themselves adequately." Thomas had been studying the layout with growing unease. "How do we get that many people down there without causing a panic? How do we control the situation once they see what's in those rooms?" "We don't control it," Sarah said with cold satisfaction. "We let the horror speak for itself. We let those respectable citizens see exactly what their friend and business partner has been doing in his spare time, and then we let them decide what kind of people they want to be. And Morrison himself, he's not going to just stand by and watch us destroy his carefully constructed life. Morrison will be dealt with separately," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of personal vendetta. "He and I have unfinished business dating back 3 years. Business that involves my people's blood on his hands and promises broken in the worst possible way." "What about Catherine Whitmore?" Sarah asked. "How do we get her out of there before the whole thing explodes into chaos?" "That's where I come in," Kaelen said. "While you're conducting your guided tour of hell, I'll be extracting the new bride-to-be from her golden cage. With any luck, we can get her clear of the ranch before Morrison realizes what's happening. And if we don't have luck, then we improvise. But one way or another, that woman doesn't spend another night under Morrison's roof." The sun was climbing toward noon when they finalized their preparations, checking weapons, and reviewing contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. Thomas had reluctantly agreed to participate, though his expression suggested he thought they were all walking willingly into their own graves. "There's something else we need to discuss," Joseph said as they prepared to leave the mining camp. "Something about what happens after tonight, assuming we survive long enough for there to be an after." "What about it? Morrison's not the only corrupt official in the territory. He's part of a larger system that profits from keeping certain people powerless and certain truths buried. Even if we destroy him, that system will try to destroy us in return." Sarah understood what he was really saying. "You're asking if we're prepared to spend the rest of our lives as fugitives. I'm asking if you're prepared to fight a war that might never really end. Because once we start down this path, once we make ourselves enemies of people with that much power and influence, there's no going back to quiet lives and peaceful retirements." Kaelen checked his rifle one final time, his face grim with the weight of decisions that would define the rest of their lives. "I buried my wife and daughter 3 years ago. I've been dead inside ever since, just going through the motions of living without any real purpose. If fighting this war gives meaning to whatever years I have left, then it's worth the risk." "And you?" Joseph asked Sarah. She looked at the scars on her arms, thinking about 9 years of systematic torture, about Margaret's broken body hanging from a chandelier, about Catherine Whitmore walking innocently toward the same fate. "I've been a prisoner my entire adult life. If this is my chance to be free, really free, then I'll take it regardless of the consequences." "Then we're committed," Joseph said with finality. "Whatever happens tonight, whatever the cost, we see this through to the end." The ride to Morrison's ranch took place in the golden light of late afternoon, 3 figures moving across high desert terrain that painted itself in shades of copper and amber as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. They traveled separately, approaching from different directions to avoid drawing attention, with plans to rendezvous near the ranch boundary as darkness fell. Sarah rode alone for the first time in over a week, and the solitude gave her space to think about what lay ahead. In a few hours, she would return to the place that had been both home and hell for most of her life, but this time she would come as an avenging angel rather than a helpless victim. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with something that felt like peace. For 9 years, she'd been trapped in a nightmare of her father's making, convinced that escape was impossible and resistance was futile. Tonight she would prove that even the most carefully constructed hell could be challenged by people who'd found something worth fighting for. The Morrison Ranch sprawled across a valley that had once been Apache hunting grounds, its main house rising like a monument to stolen prosperity from land that had been watered with native blood. Lights blazed from every window, and the sounds of celebration drifted across the evening air like mockery of every person Morrison had destroyed to build his empire. Sarah watched from a ridge overlooking the property, counting guards and noting patrol patterns while her companions took up their own observation positions. Below, carriages arrived in steady streams, disgorging passengers dressed in their territorial finest for what they believed would be a celebration of love and prosperity. Instead, they were about to witness the exposure of evil that had hidden in plain sight for far too long. "Are you ready for this?" Kaelen's voice came from the darkness beside her, barely audible above the desert wind. "I've been ready for 9 years," she replied, The question is whether I'll be strong enough to see it through when the moment comes. You'll be strong enough. You've survived everything else. You'll survive this too. And afterward, assuming there is an afterward, Kaelen was quiet for a moment, considering futures that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. Afterward, we find out what kind of people we become when we're finally free to choose for ourselves. I used to dream about being free, Sarah said softly, but I never really believed it was possible. Now that it's within reach, I'm not sure I know how to live without walls around me. Then we learn together, because whatever else happens tonight, you're not facing the future alone anymore. The lights below seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as the celebration reached its peak. Unaware that justice was finally climbing down from the mountains to settle accounts that had been overdue for far too long. In a few hours, Thaddeus Morrison's carefully constructed world would begin to collapse, and with it the illusion that evil could hide behind respectability indefinitely. Sarah checked her weapons one final time, said a silent prayer for the woman she was about to save and the monster she was about to destroy, and began her descent toward a reckoning that had been 9 years in the making. The broken silence that had begun beside a blood-red river was about to become a roar of justice that would echo through the territorial mountains for generations to come.